This analysis explores the central arguments of Francis Fukuyama's book, The Origins of Political Order. The work is an ambitious attempt to provide a comprehensive account of how the core institutions of modern politics came into being. It seeks to answer a fundamental question: what are the historical origins of the state, the rule of law, and accountable government? The investigation spans a vast historical and geographical canvas, beginning with the biological foundations of human social behavior in our pre-human ancestors and tracing political development up to the eve of the French Revolution. The author's purpose is to understand why some societies have been able to construct stable, prosperous, and liberal democratic polities, while many others have remained trapped in cycles of tyranny, violence, and poverty. The intellectual context for this work arises from the challenges to the prevailing theories of modernization that became apparent in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Following the end of the Cold War, there was a widespread belief that the spread of liberal democracy was an inevitable historical process. However, the difficulties encountered in building stable states and democracies in regions like the former Soviet Union, the Balkans, Africa, and the Middle East challenged this optimism. Efforts by the international community to promote good governance often failed, suggesting a deep-seated misunderstanding of what political institutions are and where they come from. This book was written in response to this perceived intellectual deficit. It argues against simplistic models that assume political development follows a single universal path, or that it is a straightforward byproduct of economic development. Instead, it posits that the development of political institutions has followed highly divergent paths across different civilizations, and that the creation of a modern liberal democracy is a contingent and historically rare achievement. The author's stated position is that a proper understanding of political development requires a return to broad comparative history. It is not enough to look at the recent past or to focus on a single society. A deep historical perspective is necessary to see how the constituent elements of political order were assembled over long periods. The motivation is to provide a framework for understanding not just political development, but also its opposite, political decay. The book contends that political institutions, once created, are not self-sustaining. They are under constant threat from the natural human tendency toward patrimonialism, the favoring of family and friends, and can decay if they fail to adapt to changing circumstances. The analysis, therefore, is not just a historical narrative, but also a cautionary tale for established democracies, which are themselves vulnerable to institutional rigidity and decay. The author seeks to move beyond the narrow, often ahistorical approaches of contemporary political science and economics, and to re-engage with the classical tradition of political thought that saw the study of history as essential to understanding politics. The core problem the book addresses is the puzzle of how to create modern political institutions, a challenge encapsulated by the phrase "getting to Denmark." Denmark is used as a shorthand for an idealized society that is stable, peaceful, prosperous, and has low levels of corruption. The central question is why it has proven so difficult to replicate this outcome in much of the developing world. The book argues that the problem lies in a failure to appreciate that Denmark is the product of a very long and complex historical process. Its success rests upon a delicate balance of three sets of institutions: a strong and effective state, the rule of law, and democratic accountability. The historical record shows that these three institutions did not arise together. They appeared at different times, in different places, and for different reasons. The modern state first emerged in China. The rule of law had its origins in medieval Europe, and accountable government first appeared in England. The book's central task is to explain the separate origins of each of these institutional pillars and to show why combining them into a single stable political order has been such a formidable challenge. The argument of the book unfolds across a series of logically connected stages outlined here. The analysis begins by defining the central puzzle of political order and establishing the conceptual framework. This first section explains what political order consists of, why it is so difficult to achieve, and introduces the three core institutions, the state, rule of law, and accountability, that form the basis of the entire analysis. This framework establishes the criteria by which different societies will be judged and compared. The narrative then proceeds chronologically and thematically, starting with the very foundations of human society. The second stage, from kinship to the state, examines the biological basis of human politics and the transition from kinship-based societies to the first states. This section is foundational because it argues that kinship is the default mode of human social organization, and that overcoming it is the first and most significant hurdle in political development. From this general problem, the analysis moves to its first major case study, ancient China. This third part presents China as the first civilization to create a modern, impersonal state centuries before any society in Europe. The Chinese case is presented as a paradigm of state formation driven by military competition. Understanding China's precedent is crucial because it sets a benchmark against which the development of other civilizations can be measured. The fourth section then employs a comparative method to explore why other major civilizations did not follow China's path. It analyzes the divergent paths of India and the Islamic world. This comparative analysis is essential for identifying the specific factors that promoted early state building in China and the countervailing forces, such as religion and social structure, that inhibited it elsewhere. After thoroughly examining the origins of the state, the argument shifts focus to the second major institution. The fifth part, The Origins of Law, investigates the emergence of the rule of law. It argues that the rule of law had a distinct and separate origin from the state, rooted in religion and the unique historical power struggle between church and state in Western Europe. Finally, the analysis addresses the third institutional pillar, in the sixth section, The Rise of Accountability. This part explains how accountable government, the idea that rulers are responsible to the ruled, emerged from the specific political struggles and balance of social forces present in early modern England. The book concludes by synthesizing these separate historical threads, demonstrating that by the 18th century, all the components of modern political order had been created, but no single society had yet succeeded in combining all three. The central question that animates this entire work is, at its heart, a simple one. Why are some countries stable, prosperous, and democratic, while so many others are plagued by instability, poverty, and tyranny? This question gained a new urgency in the decades following the end of the Cold War. A wave of democratization across the globe initially fostered a sense of historical optimism. It seemed to many observers that liberal democracy was the default, the end point of political evolution. Yet this optimism was soon tempered by a persistent anxiety. Many of these new democracies proved to be fragile, succumbing to corruption, populism, or a swift return to authoritarianism. At the same time, even long-established democracies began to show signs of institutional rigidity, political polarization, and decay. The book argues that this fragility arises because modern societies often take their political institutions for granted, with little understanding of how they were created or how difficult they are to maintain. There is a tendency to see the finished product, a stable democracy, and assume it as the natural state of human affairs. The author contends that this is a profound error. The default condition of humanity throughout most of its history has not been political order, but disorder, violence, and insecurity. Political institutions are artificial constructs built slowly and painfully over many generations. Moreover, political decay is a constant and recurring threat. Decay happens when those same institutions fail to adapt to new challenges and changing social and economic circumstances. It occurs when elites capture the state for their own benefit, and when the natural human tendency to favor one's own family and friends, patrimonialism, undermines the impersonal rules that are the bedrock of a modern state. The real puzzle of politics, then, is not to explain failure, which is common, but to understand success. The challenge is to uncover the specific historical processes that create effective political institutions in the first place, and to appreciate just how remarkable, contingent, and fragile that achievement truly is. To make this abstract puzzle more concrete, the author adopts a metaphor. The problem of political development is the problem of getting to Denmark. In this formulation, Denmark is not just the specific country in Scandinavia. It serves as an ideal type, a symbol for any society with high-quality political and economic institutions. It represents an imagined endpoint of development, a nation that is stable, democratic, peaceful, prosperous, and inclusive, with extremely low levels of political corruption and a high degree of social trust. For decades, the international community has been engaged in a massive, often very expensive, state-building enterprise, attempting to figure out how to transform fragile or failed states, places like Somalia, Haiti, Iraq, or Afghanistan, into something resembling Denmark. These efforts, however, have been marked by a profound lack of success. The book argues that this failure stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of what makes Denmark work. Western policymakers and development agencies often operate with a conceptual checklist of desired attributes. They seek to export formal institutions like regular elections, free markets, and a written constitution. The underlying assumption is that if these formal structures can be put in place, a functional state will naturally emerge. This approach, however, ignores the deep, complex, and historically specific origins of the underlying institutions that make Denmark's formal democracy function. Denmark's success is not the result of a clever plan implemented over a few years. It is the end product of more than 1,000 years of political history. Its institutions evolved through a long, arduous, and often violent journey. The book aims to fill in that historical amnesia. Its goal is to understand the long and contingent processes that were required to create the first Denmarks, and to demonstrate that there are no institutional shortcuts to achieving this kind of stable political order. To analyze the historical journey of political development, the book provides a core analytical framework built on three distinct sets of institutions. It argues that a modern, successful liberal democracy rests upon a stable balance of these three pillars. The first is the state. Following the classic definition provided by the sociologist Max Weber, the state is a hierarchical, centralized organization that successfully claims a monopoly on the legitimate use of force over a defined territory. The primary function of the state is to concentrate and wield power effectively. It needs this power to enforce laws, defend its borders against external threats, provide essential public goods like infrastructure and education, and manage the affairs of a complex society. What distinguishes a modern state is its impersonal nature. It is a bureaucracy that is supposed to treat citizens according to a set of rules rather than on the basis of personal relationships. Without a strong state, society descends into anarchy, factionalism, and civil war. The second pillar is the rule of law. This concept is crucially distinct from what is called rule by law. Rule by law is simply the use of law by a state as an instrument to control its population. It is something that even the most repressive autocracies practice. The rule of law, by contrast, means that a society possesses a set of rules of justice, often seen as originating from a source outside of politics like religion or reason, that are binding on the entire community. Most critically, these laws are binding on the most powerful political actors in the society, the rulers themselves. The rule of law is therefore a mechanism that constrains and limits the arbitrary use of state power. The third and final pillar is accountable government. This means that rulers believe they are responsible to the people they govern and are compelled to act in the people's interests rather than for their own personal enrichment. In the modern world, this accountability is typically achieved through procedural mechanisms like free and fair elections. However, the underlying principle is more fundamental. It is the idea that the government is a servant of the people, not their master. The miracle of modern politics is that some societies have managed to combine all three of these institutions. This is not a natural or obvious outcome, because the three pillars exist in a state of deep and continuous tension. The state must concentrate power, while the rule of law and accountable government seek to constrain and limit that very same power. The central historical task of this book is to understand how each of these institutions developed separately, often in different civilizations and at different times, and how they eventually, in some rare cases, came together in a stable balance. The historical journey of political development begins before the existence of the state itself. The default mode of human social organization, the form that has existed for the vast majority of human history, is not the state, it is kinship. Human beings are biological creatures, and like many other animal species, they are programmed by evolution to favor their relatives. This principle, known in evolutionary biology as kin selection or inclusive fitness, means that individuals will act altruistically toward those who share their genes, even at a cost to themselves. This natural sociability, this powerful preference for family and kin, forms the bedrock of all human societies. Before the emergence of the state, this was the only basis for social cooperation. The author refers to this powerful, biologically rooted system as the tyranny of cousins. In a kinship-based society, all social obligations, loyalties, and an individual's very identity are defined by their position within a network of relatives. Before a formal, impersonal state can emerge, this deeply ingrained system of kinship has to be overcome or superseded by a new, more abstract, and more impersonal form of association, loyalty not to one's family, but to the state itself. The entire history of political development can thus be seen as the struggle to subordinate these natural patrimonial forms of social relationship to impersonal institutions that treat people as individuals rather than as members of a kin group. This transition is the first and most difficult step in creating political order. The book traces an evolutionary path of social organization, moving from simple to more complex forms. The first and most basic stage is the band-level society. This is the organizational form of most hunter-gatherer groups, and was the default for humanity for tens of thousands of years. Bands consist of small, mobile groups of genetically related individuals, typically numbering no more than a few dozen people. This level of social organization is not unique to humans. It is quite similar to what is observed in higher primates like chimpanzees, where the core of the group is organized around close kin who hunt and forage together. The next major step up in social complexity is the tribal-level society. This transition typically occurs with the advent of agriculture, which allows for larger, more settled populations. A tribe is formed when multiple bands or kinship groups come to see themselves as related through descent from a distant, often mythical, common ancestor. These larger tribal formations, which can number in the hundreds or thousands, are what anthropologists call segmentary lineages. While they can mobilize large numbers of people for warfare, they remain fundamentally decentralized. They lack a single, central authority with the power to enforce rules across the entire group. Power is diffuse and contested among the different lineage segments. The final step is the emergence of the state-level society. This represents a radical and revolutionary break from the past. A state is a centralized institution that successfully claims a monopoly on the legitimate use of force within a given territory. It creates a formal and permanent distinction between rulers and the ruled, and possesses specialized institutions for coercion, like an army and a police force, that do not exist in the same way in tribal societies. The state is no longer based on kinship. In fact, its existence requires the subordination of kinship loyalties to loyalty to the state. The move from tribe to state is the critical juncture in political development. To understand pre-state societies, the concept of the segmentary lineage is absolutely essential. This is the fundamental organizational principle of a tribe. It is a system where every individual understands their social position, their friends, and their enemies based on their genealogy. A person's primary loyalty is not to a king, a constitution, or a nation, but to their lineage. Political relationships are understood in terms of family relationships. A close cousin is a political ally, while a distant cousin is a potential rival. In a segmentary society, all of the core functions that a state would later provide are handled by the kin group. Justice, for example, is administered by the kin group, often through the threat of collective retaliation. If a person from one lineage harms a person from another, the entire kin group of the victim is obligated to seek revenge against the entire kin group of the perpetrator. Property is held, and economic life is organized by the kin group. Social welfare and security are provided by the kin group. This system is incredibly resilient and powerful precisely because it is rooted in natural human sociability and the biological imperative to favor kin. But this very strength makes it the single greatest obstacle to state formation. For a state to exist, it must establish a new, overriding principle of loyalty to the impersonal state itself. It must persuade, or more often, force people to abandon, or at least subordinate, their powerful pre-existing loyalty to their kin. The history of early state-building, therefore, is the history of the violent and protracted struggle between the nation-state, which seeks to create a uniform administration over a territory, and the entrenched tribal kinship groups that resist it.
The analysis now turns to the first major case study of state formation, which the book argues is the most important one. The author contends that the first modern state did not emerge in Europe, as is commonly assumed, but rather in China, over 2,000 years earlier during the Qin dynasty. This reframing of world history is critical. Instead of viewing European development as the universal norm, the book treats China as the paradigm of early state formation. It then poses the question of why other civilizations failed to follow its path for such a long time. The primary driver of this precocious state development was violence on an epic scale. Borrowing the famous phrase that the historian Charles Tilly used to describe Europe's later development, the book argues that in ancient China, war made the state, and the state made war. Relentless, centuries-long military competition among rival principalities created immense selective pressures. These evolutionary pressures strongly favored political units that could effectively centralize power, raise large armies through mass conscription, extract resources through universal taxation, and create efficient, merit-based bureaucracies to manage it all. Political units that failed to adapt to this new, brutal logic of interstate warfare were conquered and absorbed by those that did. This was not a matter of choice, it was a matter of survival.
This timeline illustrates the brutal logic of military competition playing out over nearly 2 millennia. At the beginning of the semi-mythical Zhou dynasty around 2000 BC, the territory of what would eventually become China was highly fragmented. It consisted of perhaps as many as 10,000 small, tribal political units, each ruled by a local chief. Over the next 1,800 years, a slow but steady process of violent consolidation took place. The number of independent polities shrank dramatically under the Western Zhou dynasty to around 1,200. This process accelerated dramatically in the Eastern Zhou period, beginning in the 8th century BC, culminating in what is known as the Warring States period, which lasted from the 5th century to the 3rd century BC. By this time, only 7 major states remained, locked in a desperate existential struggle for survival. This period of intense, unremitting warfare forced rulers to innovate institutionally. The old style of aristocratic chariot warfare was replaced by mass infantry armies composed of conscripted peasants, which in turn required states to develop sophisticated methods for registering households, levying taxes, and administering territory directly. The process of consolidation reached its bloody conclusion in 221 BC, when the state of Qin, the most ruthlessly efficient, highly militarized of all the warring states, conquered all its rivals and created the first unified Chinese empire. This was not a gradual or peaceful evolution toward greater political unity. It was a process of political elimination, a brutal contest for survival driven by centuries of constant war. The key to the Qin state's unprecedented success in state building was a radical political ideology known as legalism. Legalism stood in direct opposition to the dominant traditional philosophy of the time, Confucianism. Confucianism was built on the foundation of the family. It saw filial piety and loyalty to one's kin as the bedrock of both social and political order. For Confucians, a well-ordered state was simply the well-ordered family writ large, and the ruler should govern through moral example, like a benevolent patriarch. The legalists, by contrast, saw this powerful family loyalty as the chief obstacle to state power.
Thinkers like Xiangyang, a chief minister in the state of Qin during the 4th century BC, argued that for the state to be strong, it had to systematically break the power of traditional kinship groups and establish a direct, unmediated relationship with each individual household. The state had to replace loyalty to family with loyalty to the ruler. Under Xiangyang's guidance, the Qin state implemented a series of ruthless and transformative reforms based on legalist principles. It dispossessed the old hereditary aristocracy of their lands and power, created a rational bureaucracy where promotion was based on merit, primarily military merit, and imposed a uniform code of harsh, impersonal laws that applied to everyone regardless of social rank. These reforms were explicitly and single-mindedly designed to maximize the state's ability to extract resources, grain and manpower, for its ever-expanding war machine. While Confucianism would later return as the official state ideology under the succeeding Han Dynasty, it was the brutal efficiency of legalism that provided the institutional blueprint for the first modern state in history. Having established China as the pioneer of successful state building, the book then turns to a crucial comparative analysis. If the pressures of prolonged warfare led to the creation of a modern state in China, why didn't the same dynamic produce a similar outcome in other major civilizations? Both India and the Middle East, for example, also experienced long periods of intense military conflict. Why did this not lead to the formation of strong, centralized states comparable to the Chinese model? This comparative method is essential to the book's argument. By examining cases where state formation did not occur in the same way, it helps to isolate the specific factors that were critical in the Chinese case. It allows the analysis to move beyond a single story and to identify the variables that can either enable or, in these other cases, prevent the development of strong centralized state institutions. The author argues that in both India and the Islamic world, different social structures and ideological conditions created very different political outcomes. These cases demonstrate that there was no single, universal path of political development. History is filled with divergent trajectories. This table offers a stark comparison between the political trajectories of China and India, highlighting the fundamental difference in the relationship between the state and society. In China, the state, once it was formed through military competition, became the dominant institution in society. It decisively shaped the course of Chinese civilization and subordinated all other social structures, including the family, to its needs. In India, by contrast, society always remained stronger than the state. The primary reason for this, the author argues, was the early development and consolidation of a powerful and deeply entrenched religious and social system. The rise of Brahmanism created a rigid social hierarchy, the caste system of 4 major varnas and thousands of local kinship groups known as jatis that became the unchangeable bedrock of Indian society. This system was sanctioned by a complex religious doctrine and was enforced not by political rulers, but by the priestly Brahmin class, who stood at the top of the hierarchy. In this system, political rulers who belonged to the Kshatriya or warrior class were subordinate to the Brahmins in the spiritual hierarchy. They lacked the religious legitimacy to fundamentally reorganize society in the way that China's legalist reformers had. As a result, no Indian ruler was ever able to achieve the kind of absolute power held by a Chinese emperor or to create a unified, centralized, bureaucratic state that could penetrate and reshape society. The state in India remained generally weak, fragmented, and decentralized, unable to overcome a society structured by the powerful, religiously sanctioned rules of caste and kinship. In India, politics was, in effect, subordinate to social and religious structure.
The Islamic world presents yet another divergent path in political development. Like other societies, early Islamic rulers faced the persistent challenge of tribalism. The Arab tribes that formed the backbone of the early Islamic conquests were fiercely independent, and their loyalty to the central caliph was often conditional and unreliable, based on shifting alliances and personal ties. To overcome this problem, rulers in the Abbasid Caliphate and later Islamic dynasties developed a unique and remarkable institutional solution: military slavery. They began importing young boys, typically of Turkic origin, from the nomadic peoples of the Central Asian steppes as slaves. A critical point here is that these were not plantation or domestic slaves. They were acquired at a young age, converted to Islam, separated entirely from their own families and tribal groups, and put through rigorous state-sponsored training in the arts of war and public administration. The explicit goal of this system was to create a new military and administrative elite that had no pre-existing family, tribal, or regional loyalties. Their loyalty was meant to be exclusively and personally to the ruler who owned them. These military slaves, known as Mamluks, formed the basis of state power in many parts of the Muslim world for centuries. In Egypt, they eventually became so powerful that they seized control of the state themselves and ruled as a military caste for over 250 years. The Mamluk system was an ingenious, if brutal, institutional solution to the problem of tribalism. But it was a solution that allowed rulers to build powerful professional armies without having to fundamentally transform the underlying tribal nature of the society they governed, making its developmental path fundamentally different from that of China. Having examined the origins of the state, the analysis now moves to the second key institution of political order, the rule of law. If the state is about the concentration and effective use of power, the rule of law is about constraining and regularizing that power. The book makes a strong claim about its origins. The rule of law did not and could not originate from secular rulers or from the state itself. States and their rulers are inherently hungry for power. Their natural inclination is to expand their authority, not to accept constraints on their own actions. Instead, the author argues that the idea that law could be a sovereign entity, superior even to the king, has its historical roots almost exclusively in religion. It emerged from the belief, common to several major world religions, that there existed a source of divine justice and sacred law that was higher than any man-made secular law. For the rule of law to emerge and be institutionalized, a society must first come to believe that the most fundamental laws are divinely inspired or part of the natural order of the world, and therefore cannot be arbitrarily changed by a secular ruler simply to suit his own political purposes. This religious foundation provides law with a legitimacy that is independent of the state. This slide highlights a distinction that is absolutely critical to the entire argument of the book. It is the distinction between the rule of law and rule by law. Rule by law is what was seen in legalist China. The Chinese emperor created a vast and sophisticated legal code, but it was his law. He was its source, and he was not himself bound by it. He used law as a powerful instrument of administration and social control. It was a tool of the state, not a check upon it. The rule of law, in stark contrast, implies that the law itself is sovereign. It exists as an autonomous body of rules, often derived from a source of legitimacy that is seen as being outside and above the state, such as divine will, ancient custom, or natural reason. Most importantly, in a system governed by the rule of law, the law applies to everyone in society, from the lowest peasant to the highest ruler. The concept that the king is subject to the law, not above it, is the absolute foundation of constitutional government and liberty. The book asserts that the successful institutionalization of this principle is a uniquely Western inheritance. It did not exist in China, where the emperor was a source of law. And while both India, with its tradition of Hindu law, and the Islamic world, with its highly developed Sharia law, had powerful traditions of religious law, they largely failed to create durable political institutions that could consistently and effectively subordinate powerful secular rulers to the law. So if the rule of law is a primarily Western phenomenon, where did this unique tradition originate? The book locates its institutional beginnings not in a philosophical text or a democratic movement, but in a historical power struggle. Specifically, it points to the conflict between the Catholic Church and secular rulers in medieval Europe, an event that came to a head in the investiture controversy of the 11th century. Before this period, popes and bishops in Western Europe were often appointed by and therefore subservient to powerful kings and emperors. But a major reform movement within the Church, led by Pope Gregory VII, asserted the Church's independence from secular control. The Church declared itself to be a separate, autonomous, and universal political and legal entity, with the Pope as its head. To support this claim, the Church rediscovered and systematically organized Roman law, developing its own sophisticated and rationalized body of law, known as canon law. It also created its own hierarchy of church courts to administer this law across all of Christendom. The crucial and world historical outcome of this struggle was the creation of a dual source of authority in European society. After the investiture controversy, no king or emperor could ever again plausibly claim the kind of total spiritual and temporal power that a Chinese emperor held. There was always another institution, a separate, powerful transnational one that could challenge the king's legitimacy and assert the primacy of its own law. This historic separation of religious and secular authority is what created the institutional space, the crack in the edifice of absolute power where the rule of law could grow and develop in the West in a way that it did not in other civilizations. We now arrive at the third and final pillar of modern political order, accountable government. While China developed a modern state and Europe developed the rule of law, it was primarily in England that a government accountable to its people first began to emerge in a durable, institutionalized form. The book argues that accountability, like the other two institutions, is not the product of benevolent rulers magnanimously granting rights to their subjects, nor is it primarily the result of abstract philosophical ideas about popular sovereignty gaining traction.
Instead, accountable government arose as the unintended consequence of a prolonged and often violent struggle for power between rulers and their subjects. More specifically, it was the outcome of a particular historical balance of social forces. Accountability emerged in places where a stalemate developed, where the ruler was not strong enough to crush societal opposition, and society, or at least a broad coalition of elites within society, was not strong enough to overthrow the ruler. This balance of power forced a process of negotiation and compromise, which over time became institutionalized in representative assemblies that could limit the power of the monarch. To understand how accountability emerged from this power struggle, the author presents a simplified model of the key political actors competing for power in early modern Europe. First, there is the king, or more broadly, the centralizing state. The primary institutional goal of the monarch is almost always to increase power and tax revenue in order to fund wars and expand the administrative apparatus of the state. Second is the upper nobility, the great lords, dukes, and barons. These figures are often the king's main rivals for power. They seek to preserve their traditional feudal privileges, their autonomy, and their own sources of revenue. And they resist the king's attempts to centralize authority at their expense. Third is the gentry, a broader class of local elites. This group includes smaller landowners and knights who are not as powerful as the great nobles, but who hold significant influence in their localities. Crucially, they are often the ones who are represented in early parliamentary or representative bodies. Finally, there is the third estate, a diverse group that includes commoners, but more importantly for the political dynamics of this period, the rising class of merchants, artisans, and professionals in the growing towns and cities. The political outcome, whether a country developed an absolutist monarchy or an accountable government, depended on the relative power and cohesion of these four groups, and, critically, the alliances they formed with one another in the ongoing struggle over power and resources. This slide shows how this dynamic of shifting alliances created two very different political outcomes in France and England. In France, the king successfully forged an alliance with the rising merchant class of the Third Estate. With their financial support, the French crown was able to build a professional standing army and a centralized bureaucracy. It used this new power to weaken and ultimately co-opt the old feudal nobility. This allowed the king to sideline traditional representative assemblies like the Estates General, which ceased to meet for 175 years in the lead-up to the French Revolution. The result was the classic model of European absolutism, a powerful and centralized state, but one with virtually no accountability to society. England's historical path was very different. Critically, the upper nobility and the local gentry did not become bitter rivals as they did in France. Instead, they formed a remarkably cohesive and powerful coalition within a single representative body, Parliament. This broad coalition of elites, representing nearly all landowners in the country, was strong enough to consistently push back against the king's attempts to centralize power. Their struggle centered on the critical issue of taxation. The enduring principle of no taxation without representation became the central point of conflict between king and parliament. This struggle culminated in the English Civil War in the mid-17th century and the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which firmly established that the king could not rule, tax, or legislate without Parliament's consent. Accountability in England was not a gift from the monarch. It was won through a successful power struggle by a unified class of elites who made the king answerable to the nation's representatives. At this point, it is possible to summarize the grand historical narrative that the book has constructed. The analysis has traced the development of the three essential components of a modern political order. The absolutely crucial insight is that these three institutions did not develop together as part of a single, unified process of modernization. There was no one-size-fits-all path to modernity. Instead, these institutions emerged separately in different parts of the world under very different historical circumstances, and were driven by different causal forces. The strong, bureaucratic, impersonal state appeared first in China, forged in the crucible of relentless military competition that began more than 2 millennia ago. The rule of law, the idea that law is sovereign over the ruler, was the contingent product of the unique conflict between church and state in medieval Europe, which created an institutional sphere for law that was autonomous from political power. And finally, accountable government, the principle that rulers are responsible to the ruled, was the unintended outcome of a specific balance of power and a protracted struggle between the king and a broad coalition of elites in England. Each of these developments was a remarkable and historically improbable achievement in its own right. This brings the analysis to the core synthesis of the book. By the eve of the French and American Revolutions, the historical moment where this first volume ends, all the necessary institutional components for a modern liberal democracy existed somewhere in the world, but they existed in isolation from one another.
China had mastered the art of building a modern state, a powerful and effective bureaucracy capable of governing a huge territory, but it had no tradition of the rule of law to constrain that state and certainly no democratic accountability. Much of Europe, and particularly England, had inherited from the Middle Ages a strong tradition of the rule of law that constrained rulers and protected certain rights, particularly property rights. However, many European states were weak, fragmented, or, in cases like France, had developed powerful absolutist monarchies that trampled on accountability. And England had pioneered accountable government through the establishment of parliamentary sovereignty, but its state apparatus was still relatively small and not as bureaucratically developed as China's. No single society had yet managed to put all three pieces of the puzzle together into a stable and enduring balance. This, then, is the challenge that would define the modern political era, which is the subject of the book's second volume. The task of getting to Denmark is precisely the task of successfully combining a strong state, the rule of law, and democratic accountability into a single functioning political order. The historical record detailed in this volume shows just how difficult, contingent, and rare that achievement is. The ultimate conclusion of the origins of political order is a sobering one. Political order is not a natural default state of human affairs. It is not an inevitable byproduct of economic growth or social evolution. Good political institutions are difficult to create. They are the product of specific, contingent, and often violent historical struggles that took place over centuries. There is no formula or shortcut that can easily replicate these outcomes. Furthermore, once created, these institutions are not self-sustaining. The author argues that human beings are by nature social animals, who tend to revert to favoring family and friends, a tendency referred to as patrimonialism. This natural human inclination to privilege one's own kin and social group is a constant threat to the integrity of modern impersonal institutions, which require that all citizens be treated equally under the law. Political decay is therefore an ever-present possibility. It occurs when institutions, which are inherently conservative and are often captured by powerful elites who benefit from the existing status quo, fail to adapt to changing social, economic, or environmental conditions. The struggle for political order is therefore a continuous one. It is a challenge both for developing countries trying to build institutions for the first time and for established democracies seeking to prevent the decay of the precious institutions they have inherited from the past.